Seeing is believing, they say. Well, when it comes to flying, it ain't necessarily so. You see, of your senses, your vision is the most important for safe flight. But when you're flying, your eyes can be deceived in a number of ways. For instance, various surface features and changing atmospheric conditions can cause problems. If you encounter them while landing, they can create illusions of a wrong height above and distance from the runway threshold. So let's cover the major visual illusions leading to landing errors. First, there's the runway width illusion. A narrower than usual runway can create an illusion that the aircraft is higher than it actually is, especially when runway length to width relationships are comparable. If you don't recognize this, you may be unconsciously flying your approach too low, and then you run the risk of striking objects on the approach path or of landing short of the runway. A wider than usual runway can have the opposite effect. It poses the risk of leveling out high, then landing hard or overshooting the runway. A similar effect comes from runway and terrain slope illusion. An upsloping runway, upsloping terrain, or both can lead you to believe that the aircraft is higher than it actually is. If you don't recognize this illusion, it also may lead you into the hazard of flying too low in approach. A downsloping runway, downsloping terrain, or both can have the opposite effect, misleading you into flying a too high approach. In the featureless terrain illusion, an absence of surrounding ground features, as when you're approaching over water, darkened areas, or terrain made featureless by snow, can create an illusion that your airplane is higher than it actually is. If you don't recognize this, your approach will be too low. There are also some atmospheric illusions. Rain on your windscreen can make you think you're too high, while atmospheric haze can create an illusion that you're farther away from the runway. In both cases, if you don't recognize them for what they are, illusions, you'll tend to fly too low. Now, if you accidentally flew into fog, it can create an illusion of pitching up. And if you don't recognize it, you may steepen your approach, often quite abruptly, and contact the ground before you'd like. Ground lighting can also create illusions. Lights aligned in a straight path, like a road, even lights on a moving train, or a shopping center, can be mistaken for runway or approach lights. Bright runway and approach lighting systems, especially where few lights illuminate the surrounding terrain, may create the impression that you're closer to the runway than you really are. Now let's take a closer look at one of these optical illusions, the dreaded black hole illusion. And here's a perfect setup for it. You're on a long final approach and it's all black around the airport, offering you very few visual cues. The airport itself is very dim. You can barely see its lights out there. Now, sometimes what happens is that pilots fly into the ground on this kind of approach, all the while thinking they're flying a perfectly safe glide path. Here's what causes it. As a pilot, you've been trained to know that if you get higher on approach, the airport runway takes up a bigger chunk of your field of view in the windscreen. But there's another case in which the runway can take a bigger portion of your field of view, even if you're not too high. And that's when, as you get closer to it, the runway takes up a bigger and bigger field of view, even if you're low. So, some pilots approaching the airport on an approach that's very shallow and very dangerous have thought they were in fine shape because as they got closer, the runway took a bigger and bigger portion of their field of view. Pilots have actually hit the ground on the way to the runway because of this black hole illusion. So how do you avoid this? It's simple. Fly to the airport at pattern altitude and fly a standard pattern. Then everything falls into place. You can prevent these illusions and their potentially hazardous consequences if you anticipate the possibility of visual illusions during approaches to unfamiliar airports, particularly at night or in bad weather. Conduct an aerial visual inspection of unfamiliar airports before landing. Use the reliable VASI system for a visual reference or an electronic glide slope whenever they're available. Recognize that the chances of an approach accident increase when an emergency or other activity distracts you from your usual procedures. Know the airport elevation and maintain your landing proficiency. Most importantly, refer to your altimeter frequently. It should be a primary aid during all approaches, day and night. Do all these things and you'll learn that seeing can be believing, so long as you see that illusions can be deceiving.